So this Keynote address.
Yeah.
We're going to be sitting there.
Yeah. So which one? Whichever works.
I got the other side.
And then the other one's still coming.
You have his coordinates?
Must have them at home somewhere. Might be at house. If not, send them to me. I'll let you know.
But he-
I'll-
That's the key for the book and the 10-page.
Yeah, yeah. 10 page is a great idea. I'll do that. Definitely. Do we stand down and talk? Or doesn't matter?
No, you'll have the mic. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's take our seats. We're about ready to start. Morgan, we're good to go? All right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming here today to this event, preparing for the dissolution of the Russian Federation that's co-hosted between the Hudson Institute and the Jamestown Foundation. While it is unknown when Russia's full scale of invasion of Ukraine will end, a Russian defeat would likely mean an end to the Russian Federation as we know it today, certainly as we see it on a map today. Because of the Kremlin's decision to attack Ukraine, Moscow's once extensive influence across the Eurasian landmass has dwindled, and the war has devastated Russia's economy, military, and social stability. U.S. and allied policymakers need to understand that the breakup of the Russian Federation is a real possibility, and we need to start preparing now and thinking about this new geopolitical reality that could emerge across the Eurasian landmass. This issue also presents sort of a dilemma for policymakers and think tankers and intelligence analysts and commentators, because on one hand, if you talk about this issue like we will today at this half-day conference, you're quickly branded a neocon or a warmonger wanting regime change in Moscow. But then on the other hand, and we're not advocating for any of that, but then on the other hand, if you don't discuss it or prepare for it or plan for it, and then it happens, then you're accused of getting it wrong once again. So I would rather plan for it and be prepared, and that's why we are here today to discuss this issue. We have two fantastic panels to discuss these issues in more detail. But before we start, we have the panels. We have a fantastic keynote speaker, all the way virtually from Ukraine, Alexei Goncharenko, MP. Alexei is a member of parliament for a region near Odessa, and he has been in parliament since 2014. He's a member of the European Solidarity faction. He is also the He's a member of the Ukrainian Rada's delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, or PACE, where he also serves as the vice president on the PACE Committee on Migration, Refugees, and IDPs. Before entering Parliament, he had a very distinguished career in local government, and he has also completed medical school, but he chose a life of politics instead of medicine. And I'll tell you what, the people of Ukraine should be very grateful that he chose this path, because while I have no doubt he would have been a successful medical doctor, he has definitely become one of the global faces for Ukraine in Western capitals, on international media, making the case for Ukraine's sovereignty, Ukraine's territorial integrity, and Ukraine's defense. But he's also getting ahead of a lot of us on the issue of the future of Russia. And he was a co-sponsor for a resolution several months ago in the Ukrainian Rada titled Resolution on the Recognition of the State Sovereignty of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria. And it passed the Rada on July 14th, and President Zelensky announced that the foreign ministry will be looking into this issue. And as a good president and with checks and balances, I think he also reminded the Rada at the time that the recognition of states is a prerogative of the presidency. But it certainly sparked a discussion and debate, not only in Ukraine about what a breakup of Russia might mean, but also for the policy community in the Western world. So with that, I would like to welcome my dear friend and member of parliament from Ukraine, Alexei. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luke. It's a big honor for me to take part in the conference. First of all, I would like to thank Hudson Institute and Jamestown Foundation, and personally Luke Coffey, for this very important event and very, I think, timely event, and very important discussion, because I think that the next years will go under the sign of what will happen with the Russian Federation how this dissolution will happen, what will be the consequences for the world. And that's why it's better to start to speak about it, to discuss it, to prepare for it, than to try to hide away from the challenges which will also appear. No questions about this. The Russian Empire is a great challenge to the world security, and the war in Ukraine shows it absolutely clearly. But the dissolution of Russian Empire, called today Russian Federation, but it's absolutely the same empire, Russian Empire, then Soviet Union, then Russian Federation. So dissolution of this empire will also cause a number of challenges for the world, and we should be prepared for them. And it's better to start to speak about this today. I would like to add a little, absolutely like Luke said, he's watching very carefully about what's going on in Europe, in Eurasia, and thanks for him and the Hudson Institute for this. But I want to add that this bill, which I co-sponsored in Ukrainian parliament and was initiated of, about recognition of independence of Chechnya and Ichkeria, finally the decision of Ukrainian parliament was made in October about recognition of Ichkeria as occupied territory by Russia and recognition of genocide committed by Russians against Chechen people in 1990s and after. So that's already happened. Also, I sponsored the bill about recognition of genocide of Cherkessian people, and that is also important issue because that's happened in 19th century, but probably that was the beginning of ethnic cleansings and genocides in this part of the world. So unfortunately, Russia continues to do this. Today, they are committing genocide against Ukrainians on occupied territories. And it shows us one thing, and I think we need to say it absolutely loudly, that, Russia is the last colonial empire in Europe. And the way these empires live, it's very clear. It's by using people as a fuel. These empires, they're not interested in developing, empires like this, they're not interested in developing the territory. They're not interested in the quality of life in their countries, because like near 10% of Russian people today are deprived from basics, from sanitation. They don't have toilets in their houses. They go outside. And it's in 21st century, one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Maybe the wealthiest from the point of view of resources, and the biggest country. So this empire lives using people as a fuel. And we can see it. We don't need to go far away in some 19th century, but we can see it just during last 20 years. When Russia finally suppressed Chechnya, just committed genocide against Chechen people, they killed 1 from 5 Chechens. Just imagine this. So 200,000 people from 1 million population of Chechen Republic at that moment. When they finally suppressed it in 2000, unborn in 2000 Chechen boys now are fighting in Ukraine against Ukraine and killing Ukrainians and dying themselves on Ukrainian soil. In 2008, Russia occupied, there was a war against Georgia. And now young men from Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which is absolutely part of Georgia, but for the moment occupied by Russia, now they're fighting against Ukraine on Ukrainian soil. In 2014, Russia occupied Crimea and part of Ukrainian Donbass. And now they're taking men from these territories to fight against their compatriots, Ukrainians, and to die in their own country. So that's how these empires work. And that's why Putin attacked Ukraine. He can't stop because he needs Ukrainian men to go ahead. To attack Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, to finish with Georgia, to attack Moldova. Just watch what's going on now in Moldova. It's right now. Today, the airspace in Moldova was closed for part of the day because of some drones there, probably Russian drones there. There is information said by President of Moldova that Russia is planning the assault on Moldovan authorities and will try to prepare some kind of a rebel or uprising there with an aim to change the regime for some kind of Russian puppet regime in Moldova. That's happening right now. Just I'm not coming somewhere else. So that's why Putin attacked Ukraine, to take Ukrainian men to go ahead. That's why these empires, they are evil. But they're not evil, and Russian Empire is evil. Empire of evil, like was said by great President Reagan. But it is not just evil, like Secretary Kissinger said in his article in Spectator, where he said, yeah, Russia is evil, but Russia is like eternal evil. It's part of world's equilibrium. And I don't agree with this completely. Russia is evil, and this evil should be finished. That's what we should say, and we can't tolerate this evil anymore, because this evil cannot be contained in its boundaries and in its borders. So they're coming out and they're attacking the free world, and that's how they will continue to do. So we need to finish with this evil. And who said that this empire should be forever? Like, again, it's the last colonial empire in Europe. Look, Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved. Nothing happened. The sky is on the place. German Empire, that is a great example. It dissolved. And who benefited more than Germans from the fact that German Empire does not exist anymore? If Germany would not go through denazification after the Second World War, Germans again would be today cannon fodder for some new tyrann. But they are not. They live in prosperous, wonderful country, one of the leaders of the world, because they came through denazification, they finished with German Empire, and they built wonderful state with democracy, rule of law, human rights, and that they benefit from this the most. And from dissolution of Russian Empire, who will benefit the most? It's Russian people, I'm sure about this. But also other nations which are suppressed today. Why Chechen people can't live independently? Why people in Dagestan can't live independently? I just will give you one number. Population of Estonia is 1.3 million people. Population of Dagestan is 3 million people. Estonia is wonderful state, absolutely successful. Why Dagestan can't be like this, or any other country or nations which are today suppressed by Russian Federation? And from all of this, we can take some kind of result that this empire should be finished. And it happened that Ukraine today is on the front line. It's quite historical thing because, you know, this empire tried to tell that their roots are in Kiev, Rus, in Kiev. And it's interesting and very symbolic that in Kiev, this empire will be finished. I think it's really a beautiful joke of history. But that's what will happen. I absolutely believe in this. I hope that this war is the last colonial war of Russian Empire. And the role of Ukraine is not just to kick off Russia from our territory, to build the fence between us and these people, no, but to make everything to dissolve this empire, not by coming militarily, not by taking militarily Moscow. No, we don't want to sacrifice any Ukrainian for this, but by helping the suppressed nations of North Caucasus, other nations of Asian part of Russia to be free. That's why it was so important that Ukrainian Rada make this decision, which we are saying about Ichkeria. I will continue to push this, and I have an honor to be head of caucus in Ukrainian parliament for free Caucasus. Also, don't forget about Belarus, which is today occupied by Russian Empire. This big nation deserves all the right to be a member of free world. It's 10 million population nation, and it is today occupied. Again, I'm head of caucus for democratic Belarus in Ukrainian parliament, because I really believe that is part of our work. Maybe we don't know how this war will finish. Maybe Russia will be defeated on the battlefield, but maybe Russia will first dissolve and then will go out from Ukraine. And that is absolutely possible, like it happened 100 years ago when Russian Empire collapsed. Just to remind you, it was not, military, the First World War was one of the reasons, but not the only reason for this. Internal things were probably more important. 30 years ago, Soviet Union collapsed. Again, the war in Afghanistan finished in 1989. That was one of these lost colonial war in Afghanistan, was one of the reasons to collapse of Soviet Union, but not the only. And to maybe the military problems in Ukraine will be one of the reasons, but there are other reasons which will cause the dissolution of Russian Empire. That's what I believe in. And we should be prepared for this because, yeah, there will be challenges. Who will control mass destruction weaponry? What will happen in North Caucasus? What will happen in Siberia? Maybe China will try to use this opportunity to fill the gap and this vacuum which will be created on the huge territories, and so on and so on. So there are a lot of questions, but let's start to prepare for them. And one of issues which I am sure that you will have that we will have today, a great discussion during this conference. But one thing I want to tell you, it's about nuclear weaponry, and it sounds like this. We should say, and it should be our objective, Russia also should be denuclearized. Not only de-imperialized, but also denuclearized, because Russia does not deserve any more right to have nuclear weaponry. Because the whole idea of nuclear weaponry club was that in this club, countries who are inside, they should never ever use it even for blackmailing. And I am not even telling about to use them, but even as a blackmailing, as a threat, they can't do this. And Russia is doing it constantly, you know this. And that means that Russia should be denuclearized. That's part of policy which should be absolutely fulfilled. It's not an easy task. I'm not saying that it's easy task. That's why such discussions are very important. Once again, we are ready in Ukraine for our new role in the world, to be one of the leaders of the free world, and we're ready for this. This is our pragmatism, to fight for freedom, because from freedom we benefit all, economically, politically, like human beings. And also we are ready to be on the spearhead of the process of dissolution of Russian Empire. One of our famous literature heroes, Taras Bulba, said, "I fathered you and I shall kill you." That's something about Russian Empire and Ukraine. We have not fathered it, but they saying that they're coming from us, but we shall finish them. Absolutely, because in other case, we will have still huge challenges for the security of the whole planet. Thank you very much. Today is St. Valentine's Day. I just want to congratulate everybody with this. And I can tell you that probably new slogan for next year's in geopolitics is "Love is to dissolve Russian Empire together." So thank you very much. And I will be absolutely happy to take your questions if you have.
Thanks, Alexei. And I know it's 4:30 p.m. in Ukraine, so we didn't entirely ruin your Valentine's Day plans with your wife, I hope, with your participation here today. We do have a few minutes for questions from the audience, if anyone would like to pose a question. But while we wait, we do have a microphone we could pass around. But I do have a quick question, Alexei. Can you tell us about your shirt?
I also chair the caucus Kuban in Ukrainian parliament. And Kuban is a very interesting part of, today it's a part of Russia, but in the beginning of 20th century, most population of Kuban, it's on the Black Sea, it's between Crimea and Georgia, we can say like, to make it easier like this. So they were this territory was mostly Ukrainian speaking. And even today, many people in Kuban speak in kind of Ukrainian language, but kind of specific one, maybe some mixture of Ukrainian and Russian. There's national songs which they're singing, that is, they call it Kubansky Kazachie songs. They are absolutely Ukrainian. Their traditions are very Ukrainian because this territory was colonized in 18th and 19th century, mostly by Ukrainians. And when the Russian Empire collapsed 100 years ago, in Kuban, people, they wanted to join Ukraine. after the dissolution of Russian Empire. But then they were suppressed, then Ukraine was again reconquered by Russia, and then the huge Russification of this region happened. But still many people there feel their roots, and that's why we have this our caucus Kuban, and you see it, UA. I think it's not absolutely accidentally that we have in this word Kuban, this UA, and it says us something maybe about future, who knows?
Right, great. Well, thanks for that. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yeah, yes, sir. If you could please identify yourself and any relevant affiliation, that'd be great. So, Alexei, we have one question coming your way.
Good morning or good afternoon to you. Greg Melcher, Center for the Study of New Generation Warfare. Not trying to push anything in terms of operational security, but there's a lot of reports that the major Russian offensive has begun as of now in the last day or two. I wonder if you could comment, I assume you're in Ukraine, if you can comment on what you're seeing or hearing at this point. Is that really true? Do you feel that they're moving forward at this point, or any comments you could make that you feel comfortable? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm now in Ukraine. I'm in Odessa, in my native city. Just several days ago, I was in Donbass, near Avdiivka, Pesky, near Donetsk airport, very close to Donetsk itself, with our troops. So I saw everything by my own eyes. Yeah, I can tell you that Russian offensive has started, and not just by several days, but probably during the weeks. I don't know. It's quite hard for me to predict how it will continue. But for the moment, they choose a number of points like Bakhmut, Ugledar, Avdiivka, Mariinka, Liman, Kremenaya. These are parts of the front line in Donbass where they are just very active today. They try to make offensive. They are sending people wave by wave. It looks absolutely horrific. They don't count people at all. Just they don't count them. The fields are just full of Russian bodies, or corpses of Russian officers and soldiers. They are dying in thousands, but they continue to go ahead. Also, this Wagner group from convicted people, but also regular army. And they have some very tactical and small successes, mostly around Bakhmut. So the situation near this town is very, very difficult. But I want to remind you that Bakhmut, before start of this invasion, was a town of 70,000 population, 70,000, 70. And Russian army is continuing the attack on Bakhmut from July. So they started this attack in July. Today is February. So if this so-called second largest and strongest army in the world just spending more than 7 months to take the town, which were 70,000 population, and now it's deserted, definitely. So it shows you real capability of Russia to have like a big successes. I don't believe that they will have big successes, but they can have some successes, and definitely we are paying to stop them with also with a high price. We also have big losses, definitely not compared even to Russian losses. That's even not comparable. But for us, we count people, and our best people are on the front line now. And definitely for us, it's very painful. That's why we ask the world to make the weaponry supply quicker and really stronger. Because you know what one thing is, if we will receive some weaponry in the end of year, next year, the question is who will operate it? And that is very important question. And today we have professional, motivated people on the front line. They just need weaponry to finish their job. And long-range missiles, fighter jets, armor in normal quantities, in hundreds. Because when I hear, yeah, I have all respect and we are thankful for all support we are receiving. But when I hear about, like Canada said, that we are providing Ukraine with 4 Leopards, 4, it's better than 0. definitely. But it's nothing which can change really the situation on the battlefield. So we need to, I hope that the tradition to supply weaponry, to deliver weaponry too slow and too late will be finished. We will stop to chasing after Putin. The free world will make step ahead, will give us weaponry what we need today in full quantities. And then with this, we will finish the war successfully and quite quickly.
Thank you. Alexei, thank you for that. I'm mindful of the time and I want to stay on schedule. Again, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to speak with us today, kicking off this half-day mini-conference on the future of the Russian Federation. Your determination and your commitment to your country's success and future is admired here in the United States. And we understand being in Odessa, it's a difficult time, with the electricity outages and the constant drone attacks from the Iranian drones that Russia's using against civilian targets, especially in Odessa. So we're praying for you and your family and the people of Ukraine, and we wish glory to Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. To Heroes Glory, and it was a big honor for me to be invited. Thank you, Luke, and thank you to Hudson Institute and Jamestown Foundation. Thank you very much.
Awesome. So that was fantastic. That was a good way to open up the discussion. He had, I think we all can agree he's very, powerful in his comments and has definitely given us some food for thought. So we will start just 4 minutes late into our first panel, which for me is actually early. So I will hand it over to our co-host, Glenn Howard, the president of the Jamestown Foundation, to kick off the first panel of discussion. Glenn, it's up to you how you want to run this. If the speakers want to come up here and speak, they can. If they want to stay in their chair, they can. You can do Q&A however you like. So over to you.
Okay. Well, first of all, good morning, everyone. I'm Glenn Howard, president of the Jamestown Foundation. I'd like to thank my esteemed colleague, Luke Coffey, and thank Peter for allowing us to join forces here today. I think it's very important in Washington that you team up and you try to expound the issues of the day and as in a broad of audience and as possible. And it's great to see a lot of familiar faces in the room today. It's very important that as a new younger generation emerges that doesn't remember the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991 or the fall of the Berlin Wall, that this new generation kind of understands the important issue of nationalities and what Russia is as a multi-ethnic empire. It's still the last empire in Europe, and it's very important. Janusz and I have two things in common. One of them is we had the great honor of being affiliated with Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski. And so his legacy and a lot of his writings do kind of continue to this day. He was the one who coined the term Eurasian Balkans. Not long ago, when I was talking to a friend of mine from Azerbaijan and talking about the war in Ukraine, I'm always interested in what other people from the Caucasus, their perspectives on the war, what it is and how they perceive it. And he coined it in basically one sentence. He says, the battle going on in Ukraine is the Stalingrad of the post-Soviet space. And so that thought has kind of stuck with me because many eyes are looking at what happens in the future in Ukraine. It's basically, as our Mr. Goncharenko has pointed out, it's kind of this blend of elements of Eurasian Balkans, but Habsburg Empire. There's this element of Russian militarism that won't go away even if the war ends. Even if it's triumphant for Ukraine, it's the issue of militarism. The ideology in Russia will continue. That is the ideology of empire. Then we're struck with the idea of how we're starting to see Prometheanism and the issue of Pilsudski. The legacy of Prometheanism that are emerging as you see in Kiev, the ideas of Chechens, sovereignty, the idea of a Chechen independence, the Circassians. What we're getting at is basically the idea that this is one of the last gasps of empire, and where it will go, nobody will know. But one of the things in a conversation Paul Goebel had with a member of my staff yesterday was quite interesting that was relayed to me, was how in 1991, the breakup of the Soviet Union, when they were people like Paul Goebel were there inside the State Department working and saw this, and people were just completely unprepared for it. And as Luke said in his opening statement, it's very important to kind of identify and talk about what is happening within Russia today. And no one would have even dreamed in 91 of having, or 1990, talking about the issue of nationalities and what was going to mean for the breakup of the Soviet Union. No one knows where this is going, but Janusz has adequately, come up with this wonderful book that talks about a failed state, a guide to Russia's rupture. I highly encourage everyone to grab a copy. Janusz, who's a senior fellow at the Jamestown Foundation, has very much, two very important chapters in the book are rupture scenarios. The other one is called Western planning. And this is where we need to start kind of looking and thinking about what is happening, especially in Donbass. One of the things you may not have realized that in the Battle of the Don going in Donbass and Bakhmut, you have the Georgian Legion that is fighting there, and you also have Chechen, one of the Chechen battalions is also fighting there. And when you talk about Pilsudski, you think about the Legionnaires. You think about, for those who are historically minded, about what the Legionnaires were doing, the Polish Legionnaires in World War I. You think about the Blue Division that was created and fought on the Western Front in France. So you think about different dimensions of what these volunteers and what they mean for the future. Now in Chechnya, you got 5 Chechen battalions fighting inside of Ukraine. And you have, I think, about 2 Belarusian battalions. So it's kind of interesting to parallel that you have this large Belarusian diaspora living in Poland, and then you also have this very large Chechen diaspora in Europe, and now they form 5 battalions fighting in the war. So what is the implications of this going forward? So no one knows, but maybe the World War I, the post-World War I breakup, and what happened with the Russian Empire, maybe, those are the kind of things we're going to want to look at and discuss. So enough being said, I can't endlessly quote Paul Goebel, but you got to keep in mind one of the things that Paul Goebelism has said is that the United States is a status quo power. And so we have great difficulty kind of adjusting to borders and fragmentation, as we saw in the Balkans and after the breakup of Yugoslavia, and certainly prior to the breakup of the Soviet Union. So we kind of have difficulty planning and thinking ahead about that. And so that's one of the goals of this event today, is to kind of look at that. So on that note, just also, we're going to have comments by Paul Goebel. We'll be able to circulate those. Paul took the great luxury of writing something up for his talk today. But in that, he said keep in mind there are 22 non-Russian autonomies within the Russian Federation. So when we were looking in 1991, there were 11 non-Russian republics and 3 occupied Baltic countries. But of the 22 non-Russian autonomies within Russia today, many of these are surrounded by and have no other outlets externally, and are surrounded by Russian-speaking regions, and many of them nominally ethnic Russian regions. So it's important to keep in mind. I think Goncharenko was right about to talk about Kuban, what was the historical implication of that, and their desire to be linked with Ukraine. So a lot here to say today. We have a little time to do it. Our first speaker will be Janusz Bugalski. Janusz will talk about, present some of the issues that contained in his book, and then we'll go from there, followed by our next speakers, who will be Paul Goebel, Natalia Arno, and then Anal Sharif. Janusz.
Thanks, Ben. I'll stand and speak. I can still do it. Morning, everyone. Thank you to Hudson Institute, and to follow up to Alexei, thank you for doing it on Valentine's Day. Maybe we should call it To Russia with Love. So Russia, my contention in the book is that Russia is a failed state that is heading towards rupture. Briefly, my prognosis is based on at least 9 observations. I have limited time, so I'm limiting it to 9. I'm trying to keep these as brief as possible. So I'll number them. Number 1, after 30 years, the Russian Federation has proved unable to transform itself either into a nation state, a civic state, or even a stable imperial state. Even Russian identity is a source of domestic dispute, whether it should be ethnic, imperial, civil, or non-ethnic. And I believe that Moscow's war against Ukraine has exposed Russia as an anachronistic imperial and colonial state. Second point, The war has unearthed the country's multiple weaknesses, including a contracting economy that is increasingly squeezed by international sanctions, over-dependent on energy revenues, which will plummet this year, largely because of the loss of the European market, falling revenues and a tighter budget, military losses in Ukraine that revealed the incompetence and corruption of Russia's ruling elite, growing criticism of regime policy among various leading players, and disquiet in numerous regions over their shrinking budgets. The skyrocketing defense budget this year will mean much less flexibility in government spending, greater burden sharing on defense by regional budgets, and declining spending on essential social services. Point 3, the disproportionate mobilization and deaths of non-Russians and poor Russians will aggravate frustration in national republics and regions over Moscow's internal imperialism. Disquiet will be driven by an accumulation of grievances that already exist, including rising poverty levels, stark socioeconomic inequalities, falling federal financial subsidies, deteriorating local infrastructure, environmental disasters, collapsing healthcare services, rampant official corruption, and additionally in the national republics, as was mentioned, the 22 republics named after titular nations, by intensifying Russification and destruction of ethnic identities. Moscow will be increasingly perceived as the exploiting colonial metropolis that has failed to protect and provide welfare to its subjects. Fourth point, as Russia loses the war, which I think it will, it may take a while, but I do believe they will be driven out of Ukraine, the regime will exhaust its repressive capacities to hold the country together. It will come under increasing domestic pressure, and power struggles will be evident between the Kremlin and its critics in the military and security services, between rival nationalist and imperialist factions, and between Moscow and several disaffected republics and regions. We are already witnessing this in, for instance, the mysterious deaths of over a dozen oligarchs, frequent military purges and reshuffling, and open disputes between the defense ministry and general staff and state-funded private armies, particularly the Wagnerites and the Kadyrovites. Point 5, Russia's invasion of Ukraine demonstrates that the Kremlin does not respect the international borders of neighboring states. This imperial policy will rebound on Russia itself as the country's own external and internal borders become increasingly disputed by its numerous republics, regions, and neighbors. The loss of captured Crimea and 3 Ukrainian oblasts will become symbolically and politically important in demonstrating that Russia is losing territory. Point 6, Russia's rupture will not follow a single pattern, and Glenn mentioned this, I developed various scenarios in my book, but can include elements of both the Soviet and Yugoslav scenarios from the 1990s. It will also not be a single event, but a number of rolling crises, breakdowns, opportunities, and revolts. And I think it's important to remember, and I do very distinctly, that the collapse of Yugoslavia was not uniform for each emerging state. Slovenia, Montenegro, and Serbia itself did not experience the prolonged and bloody wars evident in Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and in Kosovo. And the process of disintegration took over a decade. While several republics may exit Russia relatively unscathed, outright conflicts could materialize between the center and some federal subjects. In some parts of the country, it could lead to border disputes between neighboring republics and regions that are aspiring towards independence. It will also embolden the emergence of new states and regional federations, such as in the North Caucasus and the Middle Volga. Federations seeking to control their own resources and no longer sending their men to die for Moscow's empire. My 7th point, if Moscow deploys Russian ethno-nationalism to keep the country intact, this will provoke an assortment of ethno-nationalist responses across the country and contribute to mass violence, fanning xenophobia, Islamophobia, and anti-immigrant sentiments could light a fuse that Moscow will be unable to extinguish. with thousands of demobilized troops returning with weapons to a deteriorating economy, the opportunities for violence will escalate. Moscow can try to emulate Serbia in the 1990s by mobilizing ethnic Russians to carve out ethnically homogeneous regions from rebellious republics while expelling non-Russian populations. But this was simply hasten state rupture. My eighth point, some national republics where the number of ethnic Russians is shrinking can seek full emancipation and statehood. Several predominantly Russian ethnic regions in Siberia, the Urals, and the Pacific Far East will also benefit from sovereignty and control over local resources, such as fossil fuels, metals, and precious minerals that Moscow exploits like a colonial empire. As rebellion spreads, the weakened regime with a depleted military and a falling budget will not have the capabilities to simultaneously subdue dozens of republics and regions seeking to control their own resources and establish genuine sovereignty. My very last point, this sort of touches a little bit on the second panel this morning. Russia's democratic opposition, I believe they're incapable of transforming an empire into a democratic state. The insistence on preserving the state in its current borders is viewed with increasing suspicion among non-Russians, regionalists, and Russia's neighbors. This leaves the terrain open for alternative voices, particularly for nations and regions seeking self-determination. Hence, the message from Washington and European capitals to Russia's citizens, as I said, to Russia with love, needs to be positive, with open backing for pluralism, democracy, federalism, civil rights, and the autonomy of republics and regions. People also need information that Moscow suppresses, especially the advantages of independence and the cultivation of peaceful and productive relations with neighbors. This in itself, I think, can help embolden them by demonstrating that citizens of the current Russian Federation are not globally isolated, and they do have a future when they take it into their own hands. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Janusz. That's a great overview of and listing the points. We'll make sure we get a copy of some of your points that you made and also share that afterward today. Our next speaker is the one and only Paul Goebel, an institution in itself, and we're happy that Paul is still with us to be able to share his thoughts. If you don't read Windows on Eurasia, you should, and subscribe to it. And we're lucky that we had Paul writing twice a week in Jamestown's Eurasia Daily Monitor. Paul needs no introduction. His intellect is well known. And if you read what he writes, it's one of educating us about the issue of nationalities and the issue of where Russia's going. Paul, thank you for joining us. We're going to turn the floor over to you. We know you're somewhere deep in the Shenandoah, so please feel free to convey some fresh air on us.
Okay, thank you, Glenn, and thank you both, Glenn and Luke, for having this meeting and allowing me to attend by a distance. I'm currently being treated for 3 different kinds of cancer, so traveling around is not a real option most of the time. As many of you know, I have spent the 50 years of my professional life studying or trying to promote assistance to the non-Russian peoples that had the misfortune of falling under Moscow's rule. I am certain that no one who invites me to speak on the fault lines of the Russian Federation would expect anything other than a detailing of the many ethnic divisions that exist within the Russian Federation. And that's especially so because there is a widespread and, in my mind, rather dangerous assumption that the future demise of the Russian Federation, which I do believe is coming, will in many ways resemble what happened 30-some years ago with the demise of the USSR. I think it's absolutely essential that we escape that and understand that the biggest fault lines, the ones that are likely to have the most profound consequences, either for the reconstitution of a very different and one hopes genuinely federal Russian state, or the dismantling of that state into a variety of independent states, are not likely to be the ethnic Russians, but rather subgroups within the Russian nation, which, as I will argue, is probably the least well-integrated nation within the borders of the Russian Federation today. The reasons behind my argument are simple. First of all, in 1991, the non-Russians formed 50% of the population of the USSR, 50%. Today, they form about half of that amount, and so their role is obviously different. And even if they were all able to get independence, we would still be left with a Russian empire of enormous size. Moreover, in 1991, there were 11 non-Russian republics and 3 occupied Baltic states, each with its own proto-statehood structures and borders that with what would become foreign countries. Now, today, there are 22 non-Russian autonomies with far fewer institutions of that kind, many of which don't have potentially external borders, but are entirely surrounded by at least nominally ethnic Russian regions, and some of which don't have non-Russian pluralities, let alone majorities, even though they bear a non-Russian name. And finally, in 1991, there was widespread support for the idea among Russian liberals and also in the West for the idea that if the USSR did come apart, the republics that would gain independence would necessarily keep the borders they had as a condition of recognition, even when there were obvious examples when those borders were unjust, illegitimate, and the product of Stalin's ethnic engineering. Today, therefore, we knew in advance, there was pretty much universal agreement that when the dust settled and the USSR came apart, there would be 15 countries. Today, no one can say what the borders of this entity will be or how many countries will emerge. At current estimates that one can easily find range from 1, those who believe that the whole place will somehow be kept together, to 100 or more. The important thing here, and I want to underline this, is that the existing borders within the Russian Federation are obviously not the borders of what is going to emerge. That is fundamentally different from 91. We are talking about a radical redrawing of ethnic borders and regional borders, and that changes the nature of the game profoundly. Some of the non-Russian nations undoubtedly will seek and achieve independence, either within their existing borders or more commonly in borders changed to overcome land that was taken from them by Stalin and the Soviet government. Others, almost certainly, will seek to form broader coalitions, as Janusz has brilliantly pointed out, or even agree to autonomy within a reconstituted and genuine Russian Federation, given that they see few prospects of going it alone. The variations are enormous. To think that one size fits all doesn't deal very well when we're dealing with nations that number from a half dozen to several million, and we simply need to stop thinking that there will be a single path forward. Again, a point that Janusz has made, and I completely agree. What I think we need to understand, however, is that whatever happens in the non-Russian part of the country is likely to be overshadowed by what will happen in what we think of as the ethnic Russian portion of the country. What I see happening is the emergence of regionalism of a kind that is likely to take portions of the Russian Federation out from under Moscow, either completely as Russian-speaking independent states, independent countries, or as the moving force for the transformation of the Russian Federation. The fact is that if the Russian nation comes to terms with the fact that it is not a single unified whole, that will begin to be the basis of moves toward federalism that we have not seen in anything but the claims of the Kremlin. The events of 1991, however, are instructive in this regard if we consider them in more detail, and not just in terms of the departure of the non-Russian Union republics and occupied Baltic states. As many are coming to understand, those events were about regions and not just nations. On the one hand, many ethnic Russians in the non-Russian countries supported the goals of the non-Russians, only because the sclerotic leadership in Moscow wasn't prepared to yield power to those regions, and therefore they lived on, and therefore they wanted to have things redrawn. And on the other hand, many ethnic Russians across the Russian Federation had regional agendas then that took the form of things like the Siberian Agreement, the Urals Republic, and so on in the early 1990s. Institutions that have largely been forgotten in the West, but that are coming to mean more and more as the regions have their own agenda. And I personally think, and I'll go out on a limb, I personally think the first place to get independence from the Muscovite state is going to be Siberia, not Chechnya. I realize that goes against what almost everyone believes, but that's what I see happening. It is significant, though all too often ignored, that the Russian government was, in the early 90s, far more worried about the success of the regionalist movements than it was even by ethno-nationalism in the Caucasus. The efforts to suppress the regionalist movements were very, very active and strong well before Moscow invaded Chechnya and lost, and then well before it invaded Chechnya again, and at least won something that it thought it had achieved. This is the Russian government the current Russian government cannot acknowledge two things, because it cannot acknowledge that Russia is not an integral nation, even though it is unprepared to support the Russians as a nation that could form a nation state. One of the reasons that the Russians are less integrated than other of the nations within the borders of the Russian Federation is that, at least nominally, the non-Russian entities had the ability to proclaim that they were for their nation, even if they weren't always able to realize it. In the case of the Russian nation, even today, Vladimir Putin can't include in the Constitution the suggestion that the Russians are the state-forming nation, except by reversing the process and saying that they are the people who speak their language are the state-forming nation, which is a way of avoiding promoting Russian identity in and of itself. If Moscow changed its position on regions, it would then have to acknowledge the opportunity of the rise of other identities, such as the Siberian, the Novgorodian, or the Kaliningrader, that are far stronger than the Russian identities of those people that we normally talk about. And that they would risk facing then a kind of regionalist nationalist movement that would bring apart the Russian nation. And on the other hand, if Moscow were to recognize this diversity, they would have to take steps to deal with it. Lacking the power to homogenize the nation, which they seem to think is already homogenous, they would then have to make the kind of concessions that could lead to decentralization and genuine federalism that the Russian Constitution calls for, but that the Kremlin has never supported. And failing to grant that, they would then face movements from ever more regions to demand that they get exactly what the Constitution provides, and not getting it, they would find that some of those Russian-speaking areas would decide on exit. Today, even more than 3 decades ago, Russia faces a situation in which groups lumped together under the rubric of the Russian nation and people, and regions considered homogeneous across its 11 time zones, are becoming ever more assertive, even as the Kremlin becomes even more centralist and restrictive. That creates a new kind of scissors crisis, one that opens the way to a revolutionary situation. In that case, The center cannot hope to keep all the powers it now has without slipping ever further behind the rest of the world. And the regions are thus a revolutionary force, at least as large and quite possibly far larger than the nationalism of the non-Russians, although they receive very little attention in the West. They are in a position to transform Russia without necessarily changing all its borders if the center is clever. But the center, of course, has proved itself to be anything but. Given Putin's track record, especially recently, regionalism is set to replace the role of nationalism in the next Russian Revolution. And as a result, no one should ignore nations in thinking about the future. One should pay a great deal more attention to regions than we are currently doing.
Paul, thank you very much for that excellent overview, and a lot of your points are going to be taken away. Your point about the regions mattering is really an important one, and we'll circle back to you in the question and answer session. I'm sure many people want to ask questions. Our next speaker is Natalia Arno, and she is formerly head of the IRI Russia country director. She's originally from Buryatia, and she has a lot of interesting things to say. She's currently the founder and president of the Free Russia Foundation that was created in 2014 after she was exiled from Russia. So Natalia, please enlighten us today with some of the things what you want to say.
Thank you, Sam. And as you can see, I'm not president of Free Buryatia Foundation, but I'm president of Free Russia Foundation. There is such a different and partner organization as Free Buryatia as well. It's a huge honor for me to speak after such a keynote speaker as Alexei Goncharenko. Really feel for Ukraine, stand with Ukraine, support Ukraine. No doubt that Ukraine will eventually win, and as soon as the better, of course. And very upset that it's happening for such a long period of time now, almost a year now. Thank you to the Hudson Institute and for Jamestown Foundation for inviting me. Frankly speaking, I was hesitant to participate in this discussion when I saw the name of the topic of the discussion. But then I thought, well, first of all, it's good to be the only female speaker at this panel, maybe at the entire event. And also it's great to be this color coordinated with Paul, blue and yellow. It's also very symbolic. But also I wanted to give you a voice and a perspective of many freedom-seeking, pro-democracy, anti-war, anti-regime Russians. What happened last week, February 24th, and was happening prior to that in 2014 and in 2008 and everything what Putin's regime was doing. It's of course the worst possible nightmare, the worst possible scenario, the biggest tragedy. And again, as I said, I don't doubt that Ukraine will win. And for us, Ukraine's victory is not just some truce or ceasefire. It's an absolute and total victory of Ukraine. It's an absolute and total defeat of Putin's Russia and eventually regime change in Russia, democratization of Russia. Clearly, what Putin is doing now against Ukraine has its imperialistic character. This war is a very colonial war because Putin's regime deprives Ukraine of its territorial integrity, its identity, its language, its culture. It's not surprising because Putin's regime is such a good heir to the Soviet regime when for years and years many ethnicities were deprived of culture and language. I remember myself, it was maybe not prohibited, but it wasn't cool to speak Buryat language. It was considered as a language of villagers, of peasants, and I have 25% of Russian or European blood, Russian, Lithuanian, some Baltic, Finnish, and so on. I had to lean on that heritage more, again, to survive in Soviet schools, more than on my Asian identity. clearly what is happening now in Ukraine is a genocide against Ukrainian, and at the same time it's an ethnocide inside Russia. Russia is not only an 11 time zone country or 80 something regions, it's a country of over 190 ethnic minorities. Those especially national republics are very, very poor, and people from there are used as cannon fodder. And I'm glad that there is a huge attention to this phenomenon as well. It's very important. But with all that, we pro-democracy, anti-war, anti-regime Russians, we want to fix Russia, not to dissolve it. The only option for us is Ukraine, and the only option that Ukraine's victory is sustainable, and that Russia is not a threat to its neighbors, to its people, to the globe, is if there is a democracy in Russia. Today is a Valentine's Day. We say love is all we need. What we all need is democracy. The narrative about dissolution Russia helps the Kremlin to make more people to rally for the flag and mobilize even more Russians to support the regime. And any efforts contributing to making it more Russia's war and less Putin's war is not helping to fasten the end of the war. It's not helping us pro-democracy Russians to talk to our people, to change the public opinion in Russia, to change the situation again, to change this tide in our favor. These discussions of geographic breakdown of Russia is, in my opinion, a speculation not grounded in reality. Dissolution, possibly with some exceptions, is highly unlikely due to several reasons, and many of them Mr. Gobel already said. But, firstly, let's look at the map. 81% of the population, the Russians, it's 111 million people. And even if Siberia and the Far East are separate from Russia, it's still 70% in the European part of Russia, 70% of the population. It's more than in any European country. It's twice bigger than the population of Ukraine. Only 6 other ethnicities have population more than 1 million people, including Ukrainians. Ukrainians is the third ethnicity in Russia, but also Tatars, Chechens, Bashkirs, and Armenians. 41 ethnicity in Russia has a population more than 100,000 people. And out of these 22 ethnic of national republics, only 6 have titular nations as majority. For example, the Republic of Buryatia, or Buryat Mongolia back then, during the Stalin times, it was divided between 5 different regions. Now it's 3 regions of the Russian Federation, and nowhere, even in the Republic of Buryatia itself, Buryats are the majority. It's less than 30%. There is about 11% of Kalmyks in Kalmykia, about 10% of Karels in Karelia, and so on and so forth. Of course, all this was all intentional genocidal policy aimed to dilute concentrations of ethnicities by forceful deportations and by gerrymandering of population. But still, this is the fact that, again, I cannot even imagine how exactly this can happen. And this example that Goncharenko was telling, it's mostly that Russia, like all the names, Russia shouldn't have anything to do with Ukraine or Belarus or Georgia or Moldova. The only, and of course, there is a huge history of fighting for independence of Ichkeria, and completely supported and understand it and respected. But the example of Dagestan, for example, I know probably Mr. Gobel knows better how many ethnicities are in Dagestan only. It's at least 17, if I'm not mistaken. Another thing is there is no demand for dissolution on the ground, except for some immigrants that are lacking some realistic programs and roadmaps. We at Free Russia Foundation, for example, again, having this goal of democratization of Russia, and understanding that now it's our time, while we are still trying to change the situation and fight for as many minds inside Russia and change the public opinion in Russia. We also need to do our homework now and prepare for the time. We don't have any doubts that there will be this time for reforms, and we need to prepare those reforms, concrete reforms. We have a special website you can visit for over 3 years. I don't know how many, over 100 policy papers on each kind of reforms, political, economic, environmental, educational, and so on and so judiciary, and so on and so forth. There is no demand for dissolution on the ground level, and many of regional elected officials, pro-democracy, independent deputies, and we were working with a lot of them on the level of local level, and with 200,000 municipal seats all across Russia, and all the regional level. Those who had to, for many reasons, of course, especially after the full-scale invasion, exile from Russia, or even more so those who stayed in Russia and continue resistance against the regime. There is no demand among them for dissolution. And among this, it's also a new phenomenon that appeared after the full-scale invasion, is the appearance of rise of a lot of ethnic minority groups, Предприятие Foundation, Free Kalmykia Foundation, Yutuva, many of them. We have never had something like that before. Most of them want and strive for federalism, and they fight the issue of racism and xenophobia. They said they were triggered by the fact that, of course, mostly the people were used as cannon fodder in this war, but also they really resented this excuse for the attack on Ukraine, denazification of Ukraine. They're saying Russia needs denazification. The issue of racism and xenophobia is huge in Russia. We don't feel ourselves as real citizens of Russia in any way. In Moscow, in Petersburg, anywhere, we feel ourselves as second or third-rate citizens. I couldn't allow my son to use the Moscow metro. It was dangerous to do that. And so, like, they are striving for, they are saying that Russian Federation is such a Potemkin village. It doesn't exist. And what we really need is to have it a federation, more autonomy, more independence on the local level, on the regional level. And all this, again, anti-war initiatives, both ethnic or regional or any others, they are mostly, again, talking from this position that we want Russia to change, to democratize, to respect everybody. If we respect ourselves, if we respect our people, we will respect anybody else, all our neighbors and so on. On the other hand, it's very easy for the propaganda. This is actually Putin who uses this narrative of and threat of that the West or whoever wants Russia to be dissolved, and that's how he can, again, mobilize all the population around him. And even if we even if it happens, and even if there is this dissolution of Russia, I don't know how many territories and regions and what exactly borders, there will be a huge imperialistic resentment. Right now, for the Kremlin, there is no ideology. What is the ideology? Thirst for money and power. If there is, again, if, as I say, Russians are a divided nation, there will be a lot of Milosevic-type politicians, a lot of resentment, it will make all these territories even more imperialistic. This is what I'm afraid. And again, anybody who would be with all their populistic ideas, those who will be saying that we will gather Russian territories back, which will be very appealing for the population, they will be winning, it will be, again, and if to think where the nuclear arms will stay in all this angry Moscovia or whatever, I don't know how safe will it be for the world. And another security reason is, do we know if there is if some territories, some ethnicities, whatever, if they separate from Russia, are we sure that there will be democracies Or will there be more satellites of China, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, some other non-democratic actors? It's better if Russia can and must become democratic. Russia can and must be a good ally for the United States, for the European Union, for the democratic world against China and radical Islamism. And of course, economic obstacles. Most of regions that, again, were gerrymandered and arbitrarily divided, they are landlocked and immediately will become dependent on bigger Russia, again, or Moscow, whatever, or on other regions that would separate from Russia but wouldn't be democracies. And transportation, trade, everything would be very, very complicated. For example, there is not enough drinking water in Kalmykia. How Kalmykia, like for example, free and independent and separate Kalmykia, how it's going to get water. What we have right now in Russia, it's again two sides of one coin, all this domestic repression and external aggression. What we understand that, again, how to make Ukraine's victory sustainable is that Russia is a very normal, a very boring place, very democratic with all these procedures and institutions and processes. It won't be immediately, of course. Of course, there are chances that it could be worse. It could be military junta for some time. But what also is possible is a projection of democratic Russia through some transition period. During this transition period, we can discuss all this. If some nations would like to be separate and independent, that would be great. If empire definitely should die, the Soviet Empire should definitely die. They have never did. It maybe collapsed on paper. It didn't collapse in heads and minds and practices and beliefs of many people on this territory. This should, like, de-imperialization, decolonization should be in our minds. First of all, we have never had the reflection of that Soviet period and condemned the Soviet totalitarian regime or had illustration or just really understood our history and understood all this. It would be up to Russian people or non-Slavic Russian people to decide about their future. It won't be at any panel discussions. It will be the real, genuine demand of people either to stay all together and be a democracy or to be separate. And then again, it will be up to us to support that or not to support that. I understand that right now, when there is such a murderous, atrocious war is happening, we all are trying to find some silver bullet, some universal and very fast recipe to end it. I understand this.
Wrap it up here and just we're running short on time. So.
Yes. So I want to say that there is no quick solution. We cannot. Unfortunately, it's a huge process. It's a very complicated process and sensitive process, and we should all be very, very reasonable. And multi-ethnicity and cultural diversity in Russia can become a strength in this process of democratization and neutralize imperialism. And even if everybody is skeptical about Russia's future, I and other pro-democracy Russians, we just cannot afford it. We have to project this better future and strive for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, our next speaker, and I do think, Natalia brings an interesting point about decolonization of Russia. That's a question, and as you say, the non-Slavic nations must decide their own future. We'll see. Our next speaker is Inal Sharif, who is the foreign minister of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, which is the Chechen Republic in exile, based in London, and you're affiliated with Ahmed Zakayev, who has been relentlessly pursuing the idea of Chechen independence for a very long time. And we're delighted that you're here with us today. I know you're a film producer, you're a documentary maker, and so you have some experience in kind of documenting and conveying the images of the suffering of the people of Chechnya. So please share with us a short kind of overview of what you're going to say today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the Jamestown Foundation and for Hudson Institute to present to this conference. I'm Minister of Foreign Affairs of the government of Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, which is successor of the government of Jahar Dudayev and Aslan Maskhadov. The issue that we are discussing today is directly related to us who fight for the independence of Chechen Republic for more than 30 years. This struggle continued for centuries, but I will spare you from the long overview of the Chechen past. Many of you know it anyway. What matters today is not past. We gathered here for the sake of the future. And the best way to know it, as Abraham Lincoln said, is to create it. In order to know what the future beholds for Russia, we must realize what kind of country it is. The war in Ukraine allows this assessment. Putin started this war claiming that there is no such a nation as Ukrainians. It means that he does not recognize that the Ukrainian nation has the right to exist. This denial goes along with the idea of Russian racial superiority that Russian propagandists created during Putin's era. It also goes along with Putin's attempt to create Russian world basic and ethnic background as an attempt to rewrite Russian history, emphasizing Russia's special mission in this world. The Russian Orthodox Church actively supports the idea of this mission and all policies of Putin. Religion in Russia is the same wicked as politics. I'm sure many of you have seen the video of Orthodox priests blessing Russian soldiers for war. His words were kill children, women, old people, because Russians are not fighting Ukrainians or Americans. Russians are fighting the children of the devil, children of the devil. Children who live in today's Ukraine are children of a devil for the Russian priests, who share the same religion with many Ukrainians. What are we if Ukrainian children are devil offspring? But the truth that the world is not divided into heaven and hell. Today, world is divided into Ukrainian and Russia. In another word, the world is divided into civilization, which in the concept of Samuel Huntington are in conflict. This conflict is much more visible and dangerous now than it was after September 11. It is conflict that same the one that the world had in last century when it faced a threat of Nazis. And today the world has the same threat once again because the Russian is sick with the same disease, Nazis. Therefore, the war in Ukraine is a conflict of civilization. Therefore, is the Third World War, which is going between world and Russian Nazis. One might think that there are differences. It's true, but they are small. Indeed, World War II witnesses much more victims, and we did not reach the same number yet. The object of the confrontation is also different, but in fact, we fight the same Nazis, which come not from Germany, but from Russia. The most important difference is the position of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction which Hitler only want and try to acquire, and Putin already has. Let me repeat, Russia is sick of Nazism and it has nuclear weapons. Hence today's Russia with Nazism we can be called nuclear Nazis. I understand why the government of Western countries are cautious in this assessment of what is happening. They don't want to provoke Putin and try to avoid a direct confrontation. But experts, he do not have the same limitation and can freely assess the situation. They must explain the world how the country defeated Nazism in the 20th century, fell sick the nuclear Nazism in 21st century. I believe this assessment would allow a reviving system that helped the world to restrain Nazism 80 years ago. The same system can still be used to restrain nuclear Nazism today. Also, I want to bring your attention to a different point. This is debate going on if it was Putin who construct modern Russia or whether it was Russia who created Putin. This argument is the same as about egg and chicken. It simply does not matter for us, for humankind. What matters is that more than half of the Russians support Putin's criminal policies, which means that they are accomplices in his crime. The same guilt laid with the German people who support Hitler. How you notice that I'm not talking now about the problem of Chechen people. I'm not talking about the fact that if the world had helped the Chechen 20 years ago in the war against Russia, the nuclear Nazis would not in fact Russia, and the world would not have a problem with it today. No one heard our voice then, and it was silenced by Russian propaganda. I hope today the world understands better what it did not or did not want to understand back then. The world sees that there is a difference between Chechen people and the criminal gang of Kadyrov who terrorize the population of whole republic and beyond in its borders. We have the 300,000 strong diaspora of people who fled from war and tyranny. The large part of this diaspora live in Europe for more than 20 years. This time was not wasted. Many Chechens acquire European education. Our youth speak different languages, and we became citizens of the European Union. We have rights now, one of which is our right to choose what we want and how we want to live. And we choose not to live in a world where there is a place of nuclear Nazism. Therefore, the Prime Minister of Government of Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, Ahmed Zakayev, is constantly in Ukraine, and the Minister of Defense Detachment of the Armed Forces of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria is there too. We support the world and Ukraine in the fight against nuclear Nazism, and our contribution was acknowledged. In October 18, 2022, the Ukrainian parliament recognized the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, its territory temporarily occupied by Russia. For us, it is a recognition of the independence of Chechen Republic, and we hope that the world will follow this example. I am sure that the world will win against nuclear Nazism, and the territory of Ukraine and Chechen Republic that are currently occupied by Russia will be deoccupied. Many years ago, the president of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, Jahar Dudayev, said, "We do not forget that we are responsible for the fate of our brotherly people of the Caucasus. Unification of the people of the Caucasus into a single community of equals is the only true and promising path to the future. I believe that our territory of the North Caucasus also will be freed, and we will use the opportunity to unite into one political entity as it exists in the beginning of the 20th century. We aim to rebuild the Confederation of the Caucasus, in which we will follow the example of the European Union. This is our aim, and we must start preparing for it now. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you for that introduction and that overview. That was spot on in terms of the time. So we're going to now open the floor to questions and answers, and I understand Mr. Lutvak, Edward Lutvak, the distinguished speaker, has something you want to say or comment on, and before we open the floor. So
I'm not unsympathetic to this discussion. In 1982, I think I published a book on the Soviet Union, which talked at length about Kazakhs, Uzbeks, and so on. Fred Starr is here, so I'm happy to educate him about inner Asia. So I'm quite aware of the existence of these nationalities, and then I was able to visit many of those places in all those years ago. In the last 2 years, on the other hand, I'm a traveling man. The last 2 years, I went to Mongolia. And from Mongolia, I skipped Kazakhstan for personal reasons that Fred knows. Then I continued through to Kyrgyz and Tajikistan. Then, of course, I went to India and so on. We continued to Myanmar, Laos, and so on. In every one of those places, the American ambassador in that country, his closest companion in practical terms was the Russian ambassador. Because in each one of those countries, there was already this, by the way, half these trips took place before the beginning of the war and half after. In every one of those countries, there was already pressure, real pressure, from below for subversion, like in Mongolia, this subversion, from China. In all those countries, these reasonings about the breakup of the Russian Federation, I don't think many people there are enamored of Vladimir Putin or think that the Ukraine war was a wonderful thing and so on. However, in all of these countries, they're already losing de facto independence. They're already weakened, either frontally or by subversion, because of the loss of power of the Russian Federation. Now, if you cannot replace, if you envisage positively and optimistically the breakup of the Russian Federation, you have to accept the fact that the People's Republic of China will have de facto control of a space. Now, Mongolia only has like 3 million people, but it is a very big country full of resources. Indeed, it has some leading, the world's greatest copper, whatever. And then Kazakhstan, Fred and I met many times in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan, it was called the periodic table in Soviet days. It still has every possible mineral that anybody would want. Also, it happens to be the seventh largest country in the world. And of course, the Kyrgyz Republic, which with the acute sense of fragility and vulnerability to China, even I visited before and after the war. It was even before the war. They were trembling at why? Because of the Chinese commercial penetration and presence everywhere. They were treasuring the fact in Kyrgyz, in the capital of the Kyrgyz Republic, they still speak Russian preferentially, and they hold on to what they have. In Tajikistan, on the other hand, the half of the KGB, the old KGB frontier troops, were the stabilizing force in Tajikistan. The fact they were reduced already made people scary. In Myanmar, the United States has levied sanctions on this government of Myanmar. They don't like the government for some reason and so on. The fact is that this dictatorship, this awful murderous dictatorship, has only one ideology, and that is to resist China, even if that means turning down offers of free dams and highways and so on. Now, and then in Laos, little Laos, I encountered a Russian base. It was a small Russian base. However, there is an airstrip, and through it, they get equipment. And for Laos, which has the extremely acute sense of vulnerability, because all the frontier towns have already become Sinified. People speak Chinese. There are actually, I met in Baten on the border, Chinese municipal policemen, okay? So in all of these countries, and of course, Vietnam. Vietnam is the solid one. Finally, U.S. military started. Vietnam but it's still heavily dependent. Their submarine force, which is the only thing they have against the Chinese, is Russian and so on. Now, in regard to India, of course, India has many options.
But this is about Russian Federation today. So
correct. The point is this. The loss of power of the Russian Federation is a direct increase of Chinese power. And as the last I heard, our principal global contention was the People's Republic of China. And therefore, it means that while naturally preventing a Russian victory in Ukraine, which will be a catastrophe of a different order, a kind of moral catastrophe of the Western world, while of the absolute necessity of preventing a Russian victory in Ukraine, we must not conspire or contrive to damage the Russian Federation until you found a substitute for it, until you find a way of inserting power.
But let's,
That's why we have this conference. It's a very valid point. We have to plan for all these consequences, but we have a time schedule we have to keep as well. Thank you.
thank you. So we got a question, and Paul, I want to go back to you. I'm going to ask a question, but Paul, when the speaker finishes, I want to ask you about if you're sitting in State Department policy planning or in somewhere in the U.S. government today, what would you give advice to them how to look at the war in Ukraine, and what should they do to kind of think about it in terms of everything that's been discussed today? So please, sir, identify yourself. I recognize you faintly. Take the mic, please.
I'm Phil Peterson. I'm with Greg at the Center for the Study of New Generation Warfare. I have 3 points, starting with the fact that I agree with everything people have said. Russia, Empire, Soviet Union, Russian Federation, it's the same paradigm. Back in 1991 on the island of Bornholm, I had an argument with Paul Goebel, and I said Russia and the United States are not nations, they're ideas. And Paul immediately said, yes, exactly. The difference is the United States is a good idea. And I won't go into that any further. You know what the follow-up was. We have the same problem here with China. China's not a nation. China is another empire. There are 2 Chinas and several other independent countries. So Russia and China both have to be dissolved. Now, just to finish this first point, when we talk about Russians, we so frequently confuse the figures we get from the official figures with regard to Russians. They're passport Russians. Dmitry Olshansky, I admired his work. Great Russian. No, his father was Polish, his mother was Estonian, all right? But he was calculated as a Russian. Russians don't count the size of the ethnic Russians, the size of the country they're credited with. But these people, as Paul said it way back in 1991, these people are imperialists, are supporters of the imperialist paradigm. Okay, the second point. I think we've already seen what happened, what is happening in the greater Volga region. I'm talking about Chuvashia, Bashkortostan, Udmurtia, Tatarstan, Astrakhan. They are already have created the Idel-Ural Republic. They are already prepared. The entire infrastructure of the region is ready for independence. Tatarstan has a state treaty with the center, which allows it to have its own armed forces. It essentially has 2 interior divisions. However, I'll point out that they have all Chechens commanded by a Chechen general, all Tatars commanded by a Tatar general. Now, they have, however, very wisely allowed the supporters of the Russian imperial paradigm to volunteer to go to Ukraine to fight, where hopefully they will die and will help solve the problem for Tatarstan. And my third point is was exactly that. The whole fact that the numbers of Russian paradigm supporters in the Volga region are declining because they have allowed the creation of a volunteer brigade, which is happily dying in Ukraine for the imperial paradigm. Thank you.
Paul, question for you. 1991, today, what would you do if you were in State Department? What would you advise in this situation?
Well, Having lived through 1991 there, I can say that there was incredibly great reluctance to appreciate what was even happening in the USSR, even after the coup. Rather infamously, the United States was not even in the top 30 countries of the world that recognized the governments of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania as being not only not only de facto, but de jure, coming right after Cuba and right before Outer Mongolia, putting us in the high moral courage department. And later, when the Soviet Union was clearly falling apart, it's worth noting that the flag at the State Department of the Soviet Union continued to fly 6 days after it was taken down over the Kremlin and 6 days after it was taken down over the Russian embassy in Washington. We are a status quo power. We have been one for a very long time, although our origins would point in a very different direction. And we are regularly accused of being not. Many of the arguments that have been made about why Russia can't come apart or mustn't come apart, the idea that this would lead inevitably to Yugoslavia with nukes, which was a popular meme in 1990 and 91, turned out not to be true because no one actually controlled them except Moscow. The idea that Russia is whatever it's like, a counterweight to some other power, in this case China, also is the kind of argument that people would make. I think that Phil Peterson makes a very, very important point within the three ideas that he talks about, and that has to do with thinking about this in time. If you're trying to think about what you want to do tomorrow, you can be status quo. If you want to think where you want to be in 10 years or 20 years, you really can't. There was too much willingness after 1991 to proclaim Russia a democracy, and worse, to assume that free market capitalism would solve all the problems in the area. Russia wasn't a democracy, and free market capitalism by itself wasn't going to solve anything, except to make the criminal class at the top in the Kremlin extremely wealthy and have enough money to corrupt broadly the West. If we're interested in a world which might truly be stable, then I think we have to pursue not stability in and of itself, but those conditions which will make stability possible. I certainly would like to see whatever remains of Russia become a democratic country. I do not think, however, that it is certain that the countries that break apart have a lesser chance of being democratic than Russia that holds together. In fact, I think the argument that we can't afford democracy comes from those who want to hold everything together and use force to do so. The reality is that with all the shortcomings of what's happened around what used to be the USSR, around the periphery, more people have benefited than lost by what happened in 1991. There's real democracy in a few places, and there's movements toward democracy in others. I think we have to ask ourselves, what kind of a country do we hope Russia would be? And I would say that that goal, seeking a democracy, has to be based on, has to reflect the fact that no democracy is going to be created if large parts of the country are being held in only by military force of arms. That if you want a democratic country, you can't have a large part that's in effect occupied internally. That's what you can't have that. So you either have to allow the people who don't want to be there to leave, or you have to transform the center. Now, when I listen to some of the liberal opposition in Russia talking about how the beautiful Russia of the future can be possible with exactly these borders, I think of what was, to update an old Soviet joke about how any country can solve its problems. And the answer of Radio Armenia, of course, is that there are two solutions. There's the realistic one, and then there's the miraculous one. In the realistic one, Jesus Christ and the 12 apostles come down from heaven and arrange things. In the miraculous one, the people of that country do it themselves. We suffered an enormous failure after 1991, precisely because we proclaimed victory too soon. We did not carry on. We needed a policy of tough love. In fact, what we got throughout the 1990s, and I would argue right up until very recently, was a policy of remarkably weak neglect. If we're interested in having any state, whatever its borders are, around Moscow, that will not be a problem for others, then we have to worry about its democratization, and we have to understand that democratization of an empire is possible only with its dismantling. And that's going to be understanding those kinds of things and taking a longer view is quite foreign to many people who do foreign policy in this country and elsewhere. But ultimately, it's the only way forward, or you will constantly go back to having crises like the one we have now with the vicious invasion by the Russian Empire of its former possession, Ukraine.
Question?
Yes,
Peter.
thanks, Glenn. I suppose this could go to any of the panelists, but I suppose I'll direct it to Janusz, given his remarks. You've outlined the social and ethnic cleavages and the mosaic that is Russia. But my question is, what causes a people to go from resentful and discouraged to actively revolutionary or to resistance? I mean, what should we look for as tipping points to cause some of these groups to boil over and for the scenarios which you point out to come to fruition? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Briefly, and I do outline this in the book, and I mention a few things here. You got to look at the state of the economy. A deteriorating economy in the midst of an endless war or a losing war in Ukraine. You've got to look at demography. People in cities, if they lose a few people die in the war in the cities, it's not such a huge deal. In villages in Dagestan or Chechnya or Buryatia or elsewhere, the number of deaths has a bigger impact on the community. It's felt more by the community. And I think these sort of factors, together with all the grievances, I list in my book probably about a dozen different grievances ranging from inequalities, corruption, lack of neglect of social welfare, infrastructure collapse, and so forth. If you add to that these two factors in the middle of sanctions, which I think are going to, this year, are going to really bite the Russian budget. I was in Brussels earlier this month with a former economic advisor to Putin who said that the budget will still probably last this year, but if the military spending increases the way they're projecting, the way Shoigu and others are talking about building the military, then that could bust the Russian budget in the midst of falling energy revenues. So there's not one factor that creates a revolutionary situation. Where, you know, if we knew that, we would be able to predict exactly when the revolution happens. But there are variables, there are factors that feed into that situation, which I think Russia is now facing, much more starkly than when I finished the book. I finished the book actually before the war began. The editors, thankfully, Jamestown is very quick. They allowed me to edit and add a few things in the introduction. But I wouldn't change a single word. I would just add a few things in terms of acceleration of the collapse. Okay, let me say one other thing, which I think is very important. Talking about this does not help Putin. Remember, we keep talking about NATO is not a threat to Russia. Has that stopped Putin saying that NATO is a threat to Russia? I think it's much, we shouldn't treat Russia paternalistically. We should talk directly about what we would like to see the people achieve. Democracy, federalism. If that doesn't work, then self-determination, independence, separation from the empire. It's very clear. I think it's much better than simply denying that we have any policy towards Russia, which actually we don't, but something we should be developing. I think this is going to be covered more in the second panel, but I want to raise this issue because I hear this from these so-called liberal Democrats in exile, no disrespect, of course, to our speaker here, that talking about disintegration helps Putin. I completely disagree. I think talking about what we would support in Russia, up to and including the collapse of the empire, independent states, is actually forward-looking. It's not helping Putin.
I'd say the tipping point could be, as you see these human wave assaults by Putin just wasting Russia's youth in Donbass, you could, the army will reach a point when it has no officers to lead it and face a point of exhaustion. And you don't know where that exhaustion could go inside it and the impact. I mean, you could see quickly a collapse of fighting in Donbass. I'm not so sure there would happen, but say it happened. And then what happens if Ukraine pushes into Crimea? And then you're faced with a new kind of impact of Crimea on the North Caucasus and Crimean Tatars getting their impetus back and their intellectual influence, which Paul talks about constantly on Tatarstan itself, because Tatar nationalism grew from the Crimean Tatars. So there's a whole lot of aspects here that people need, kind of in the back of the room, at least start asking the question about where this is going. Yes? Oh, yeah. And then I'll get to you, sir. I see you.
I'm Aizen Marogi. I'm a medical retired, I'm a physician and a retired medical corps officer. I have a couple of questions, one on the strategic and one on the tactical level. On the strategic level, did we determine, this panel determined that the outcome of this war is Russia is losing? Is that where everything is going? And my second question as a physician is, we hear about all these losses by Russian army. I'm just curious to see, some of these numbers are actually quite staggering and defy the logic of, when I was in the army, defies the logic of how many casualties are expected from every conflict. So I'm curious to see, given the eloquent speakers here we have, how do we come to these numbers? Are they realistic numbers that we're hearing in the media about the Russian losses as a result of this conflict? And thank you very much.
I don't know who wants, but the numbers it's obviously the 132,000 are what the Ukrainians say. The State Department or DOD says those numbers somewhat approximate that, and then they also say on the Ukrainian side 100,000 casualties and deaths. That's what the Pentagon has said. I don't know how they're basing that, but when you assume that you're fighting on the defensive, from 3 to 1 is usually a number that's they use when you're kind of equating defense versus offense and the numbers that it takes to defeat ongoing forces. So some people can make those calculations that the losses have been extremely high. So again, the statistics come from the U.S. government, what they've said. You've got Ukraine is not revealing what its losses are, but they have indicated that they are close to what the Pentagon has been saying. So, but going further, your questions, it's human wave assaults with the Russians, exhausting its manpower in Donbass. I think the British Ministry of Defense today came out with an estimate that said that they're quickly losing their offensive capabilities because through such sheer loss of manpower that they don't have the officers to lead it. And the 155th, which fought and suffered the losses in Voldar yesterday, has already gone through 3 rounds of changes in officers leading the 155th, which, by the way, is a Pacific Naval Infantry brigade. And going back to Paul's point, Siberians taking heavy losses in Donbass, I would respectfully disagree with Paul about Siberian independence, but the point is you get a lot of Siberians dying for empire in Donbass doesn't, bode well for Putin and the empire. And we all, as Paul pointed out previously in his writings, Siberia was, Vladivostok went on for how many months in demonstrations, which we kind of forgotten about, So Paul does have a point there. Sir, you had a question.
Yes.
Identify yourself and wait for the mic.
You didn't ask my second.
Oh,
My second question.
what was the second question?
About, did we decide Russia is going to lose because people keep
Nobody
saying,
knows. I mean, I personally,
is
I
it nuclear
stalemate.
Well, it depends how you define losing. I mean, as some have said, strategically they're already losing. They keep pulling the lines back. First of all, it was regime change. It was take over all of Ukraine. It was denazification, demilitarization. That then became the 4 oblasts that they would control. Then they began to lose parts of Kherson. Northern Kherson's gone. Donbass is in check. So now it's going to be defending Donbass, trying to extend the borders of occupied Donbass to the oblast borders of the 2 oblasts of Donbass, Donetsk and Luhansk. So in that sense, Russia is retreating. At what stage they will retreat from Zaporizhia, from Crimea, from Donbass, that's up to how much support we give Ukraine to drive them out of the country.
Well, if the objective of the war is not accomplished, that you consider that a loss. Putin's objective was denazification of the Ukrainian regime, one, and also liberation of the Donbass. So these are the 2 objectives. At least that's what he
But the loss will go even further back, because if they lose Crimea and Putin's state put a lot of his, legitimacy, of his credibility in Russian society on Krim Nash, Crimea belongs to us, it's coming back to us. If that's lost, that's going to rebound. It's another fact to answer your question. It's going to rebound even further back into Russian society.
Question.
That's going to rebound. It's another fact to answer your question. It's going to rebound even further back into Russian society.
Question.
Do two W-2s make a W-4?
Are you kidding?
Hi, I'm April. I'm here to help.